Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my channel, Cafe Life. My name is Tuan Duong, and today we will be talking about your first home espresso purchase. And I will walk you through and share with you my experience on why I made that decision to buy the E61 group head. First of all, I wanted to experience something that's stood the test of time. E61 means this technology was developed in around 1961. It's been used in numerous cafes all around the world. Great user base, easy to use, easy to service, meaning there's a lot of resource on the internet and from different manufacturers how to service these machines and also to find parts, right? And also during my espresso / barista onboarding or learning at home was I needed and wanted to have access to aftermarket accessories like a distribution tool, a funnel for the portafilter, and a tamping station. So you can put your portafilter in here and here, and then you can tamp. This is the standard tamper that came with it. And this is the gadget I bought, Bose tamper made in Boston. And how this works is you just put it in, twist it, and this little tamper pushes down with the right pressure. So over the first 2 years that I've owned this setup, all these gadgets help me isolate all the variables and be more consistent as I learn. And as I got better over time, I reduced the reliance on technology and gadgets, and I learned how to properly tamp and have the right pressure. What's important with coffee, as you all know, is stable temperature control. And with this one, what are we looking at? This is the ECM is the manufacturer. The model is Technika V. I won't go into much details about the specification. You can read up on it with the link that I'll be providing in the description box. So what I really like about this machine is, first of all, white gauges, easy to read. And here you have these joysticks, right? Other machines, a bit less expensive, you would have the knobs. I prefer joysticks, so push down like that, or you can pulse it. So it's easy to use, very easy to use. This side is the hot water, so you can have hot water. And so these are the two features I really like. Joysticks similar to cafes, easy and quick, and easy on your wrist. How you fill it up, the water tanks is up here. It's about 3 liters that you can pour water up here. And the water tanks, about the boiler's 2 liters, the water tank's 3 liters. And as you can see, I have countertop height restriction. So this just fits nicely and snugly here. I have enough room for heat dissipation. A lot of other machines have dual boiler. This one I have is called a heat exchanger. So basically, for my needs, I don't do a lot of volume, so I don't need 2 water boiling tanks in the machine. So because that would mean just more maintenance to do down the road. And I'm just not interested in the maintenance. Over the 2 years I've owned this, the shower head gasket was leaking, so I replaced that. I'll be sharing another video on how to replace that, so it's very easy. Down here, we have the water tray that you can take out and go empty it in the sink. One of the features that's so special about this machine is it's using a rotary pump. What does that mean? One, it's quieter than most other E61 machines. And two, down the road, 3 or 5 years down the road from now, I'm planning to plumb it into the water line and have like another drainage straight into the sewer, so I don't need to go empty this tray and then go fill up with water. That's another topic, because before I direct plumb it into this machine, I need to install additional water filters before it gets into the machine. So, and also one of the cool features about this machine is the technology part, right? This one has a counter, so after a certain number of usage, it will pop up a message clean as a reminder for you to clean it. So what does that mean? It's like I would use Kafitsa, fill in the solid basket. You just put some powder in here, lock it in, and do the flushing. There's a lot of instruction on the internet how to do that. Personally, I follow those instructions, and also part of my routine on a weekly basis, I would like just do a standard water back flush just to clean the group head, and it would just flush down here. And then this one has the PID technology, so the temperatures has more stability from the moment it leaves the water boiler, navigates to this whole stainless steel hardware. So that's one of the selling features: stability of the temperature, ease of use, and it's just solid and easy to maintain. Like recently, I will be sharing another video on how easy it is to replace the shower gasket here. So that's about it for this E61 Espresso machine. It also came with this grinder. It's also part of the ECM manufacturer. It's the C54 manual grinder. So 54 millimeter for the grinder. Does it make a difference? Yes, it does make a difference. I used to have a 48 millimeter grinder, and when I tried this one, there was less clumping in the fine grind. So it's worth upgrading. Do I have like a need for bigger size? No. After 2 years, I've been consistent. I haven't had this urge to go buy another grinder, unless anybody else thinks else. Then you can leave comments in the section, and then we can discuss it. And then, oh yes, I forgot. The front of the machine at the top here is your warming tray. You have space for maybe 3 or 4 cups in the middle of in the front, I mean, because in the back you have that door to fill in the water. Right now there's no coffee in this machine, but I will pull the lever just to give you a demo of the noise level. And then you have your gauges. It's at 1 bar right now. This is the pressure gauge for the boiler, the hot water boiler on this side. I won't be turning this on. Then again, if you have any additional comments, you like this video, questions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll gladly get back to you. Thank you for watching.